Okay. All right, I think I'm all ready to go. I'm going to turn the lights out. It might be too dark in here, but let's see. All right. So everybody on Zoom, I have the chat box open. I'm not the best at checking it, but if you have a question or I'm not advancing the slides, please holler at me. Okay, so I don't think I have any catching up to do. So you have your first quiz on Friday. We'll talk about that Wednesday. It'll be over the material we get through by the end of class on Wednesday. So talk about that a little bit Wednesday. Other than that, you'll have a homework assignment from today. It's pretty simple. So we were talking about kind of what science is and how it works mostly on Friday. Now I'm kind of switching gears, but this is all in the same chapter. So going to continue on here with some major biological themes. So these are just themes that you'll kind of see popping up throughout the semester. And I'll refer back to these themes every once in a while and maybe ask you, how is this phenomenon or this an example of a theme in biology? So you kind of want to commit these main themes to memory and understand their meaning and be able to, if I say, what is this showing an example of theme-wise? You want to be able to answer that. So let's jump into it, and that's what I'm going to have you guys do, kind of a in-class exercise, and it'll finish up as a homework, your first homework assignment. So for you guys on Zoom, so you're not behind this document called Major Themes of Biology. I should have handed it out to you on Friday because I had it. That was my fault. That's on Canvas under modules. So that's what you're going to be working on. I'll split you guys into breakout groups to do that. Yeah, okay. So moving into the major biological themes, and I think we might get a little bit into the chemistry chapter. We're a little bit behind, but that's fine. We'll get caught up. All right. So first, there's a few different themes that deal with organization. So how we are organized as beings and how we sort of organize our idea of biology. First is going to be this theme of emergent properties. So this emergent properties is kind of a subcategory under organization, if you want to think of it that way. There'll be two more themes that fit under this organization kind of umbrella. So emergent properties, what do I mean by that? An emergent property is just one that is present at a higher level of organization that wasn't present at a lower level of organization. So if you remember me talking about that hierarchical structure of organization within the biological world, cells form tissues, which form organs, which form organisms, that kind of hierarchical structure. This emergent properties theme basically says that the higher the level of complexity you go, the more functionality something has. So I gave you a couple of examples here. Tissues. So here we have tissues, which are a bunch of cells working together to do something. Tissues can perform functions that individual cells cannot do. And then ecosystems, kind of a larger example here. Ecosystems can perform functions that just individual organisms can't do on their own. So a good example for that would be like you've probably heard, maybe you've heard that wetlands are really good at filtering out a lot of toxins. So wetlands can be really beneficial for the overall ecosystem. So a wetland would be considered, say, an ecosystem. So it's a kind of big, large set of communities. One organism cannot filter out all of the toxins that an entire wetland with all the different plants and the water and the soils can filter out. So hopefully that makes sense. I know emergent properties, when you hear that, it doesn't really logically, you don't automatically think that new properties emerge as you move up the level of biological organization, but it just means that new properties emerge as you move up in this level of complexity. You get more and more functionality. So we as organisms can do a lot more than just our liver, for example. Our liver does a very specific thing. We can do a lot more than that. Okay, so that's the first theme. The second one, still under the organization sort of umbrella, is about structure and function. So structure and function are inextricably intertwined. So you can't really separate the structure of something from how it functions in biology. So a good example of this is, say, our hand. Our hand is structured with all these little bones and muscles in it, so we can grasp onto stuff and we can manipulate a pen, right? You're writing right now. You can manipulate a pen because of that structure of all the muscles and the bones and the tendons working together. A horse has a similar, they have limbs, right? But their limbs are structured very differently. Their limbs have a very different function to carry their weight and to make them move quickly. You can go all the way out to, say, a seal, a bird. The overall limb structure, if you break it down into the individual bones, all the bones are there. They're just structured differently. And thus all of these organisms can perform different functions with their arms, flippers, whatever they have. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Structure is related to function. And then the final organizational theme we have is cell theory. And we'll get into cell theory as we get into the cell chapter in a little more detail, but all you need to know right now is that we consider cells the most basic form of life. So anything below a cell, like an organelle, we don't consider an organelle alive, but we do consider a cell alive. An organism can be made of one cell or many, many cells, but as long as it's made of at least one cell, we consider it alive. And cells are organized in a really specific way with specific organelles, which we'll go into as well. So they have a very specific structure. Okay, so those are the three sort of organizational themes. We'll consider each of those individual themes, but they all fall under that organization category. The next theme, something sort of unrelated, not unrelated, but different from organization, is information flow. This theme just tells us that information flows from one generation to the next. All of the DNA that you have came from your parents. That's all of the information they gave you to make you who you are. So here, this information flow, we're really talking about over generations. So that DNA that got passed on from your parents to you is basically telling your body exactly how to do everything it does. It's coding for the proteins, which we'll talk about much further down the line in the semester. It's coding for the proteins that create everything about how you function. So that's the idea behind information flow as a theme. And that happens across the entire biological world. All living organisms have DNA. You go down to a bacterial cell, it has DNA. It's not as complicated as ours, obviously, but it has DNA and it passes its DNA on, its hereditary information, genetic information, on to its offspring. And then energy and matter. So this theme really just deals with the idea that energy and matter moves through an ecosystem and is used by different levels within that ecosystem. So if you kind of think about a food web, back to some pretty basic biology, you know that a rabbit is going to be eating plants. So they're taking in that energy from the plant and the nutrients from the plant and utilizing it. So all of life basically requires this transfer of energy and this transfer of matter. If you think about it, you constantly are using energy and matter from organisms that you're consuming. And going back to something I talked about, I think on Friday, maybe Wednesday, I don't remember. The sun is the ultimate source of all of the energy, not the matter, but the energy. So the sun provides all of the energy that is on our planet. It makes its way into plants, which use it to make food for everything else, basically. Next, we have interactions. There are interactions happening between pretty much, you're interacting with something else. Most organisms are interacting with something else in some way throughout their lifetimes. So you can scale that all the way up to ecosystems where organisms are interacting with each other or communities maybe. So in this example here, we have a young, I think that's a dragonfly, a young dragonfly eating a fish. So that would be predation. So predation is a great example of an interaction in an ecosystem. You also have competition between members of the same species. So these two male beetles fighting each other, that's an interaction. And you can break it down to the sub-organismal level. So within just one organism, there's all these interactions happening too. So all of our multiple organs are working together in that organ system to carry out a function. So the example I have here is the negative feedback loop for insulin production. So insulin, you guys may kind of be familiar with, it helps control our blood sugar. So if you don't have enough insulin in your blood, in your body, your blood sugar could get too high or too low. So there's a lot of different organs that are going to basically function together to create that insulin and keep our glucose levels, the blood sugar levels, where they need to be. So those are interactions between individual organs within one body. So it's not just interactions between individuals. So interactions happen kind of across the spectrum. And then we have the big one, which is evolutionary change. So this is what I'll call the core theme of biology. And the take-home message here is that evolution is basically going to account for the similarities between organisms as well as the differences, which seems sort of counterintuitive, but the unity and the diversity of life is all due to evolution. So it kind of underlies everything and underlies pretty much all of the other themes that we talked about. You may have heard of these 3 domains of life. So we have basically 3 huge groupings that we put organisms into. There's kind of 2 bacterial ones, the archaea and the bacteria. So those are the single-celled organisms. And then we have eukaryota, which is all of the multicellular organisms. So pretty much everything, every animal or plant you would think about on a daily basis falls into eukaryota. And all organisms, you can trace back their origination to about 3.5 billion years ago, from simple single-celled organisms. So all of life diversified from these simple single-celled organisms 3.5 billion years ago into these three major domains. And the last bullet point I have up there is just kind of an interesting factoid that I think maybe a lot of people aren't familiar with. We'll talk about it a lot when we get, again, way towards the end of the semester. But pretty much every organism from bacteria to humans uses the same genetic code. So the same, basically the same letters or nitrogenous bases. We'll learn what those are. But the same code to make the proteins that make the organism. So same genetic code across essentially all of the domains of life. Which is pretty fascinating. So an earthworm has the same, its code will code for the same proteins that our code will code for. Pretty cool. So I'm going to go into a little bit more about this since this is our core theme for biology. And first I want to take a minute and just define evolution from a biological perspective. And you can break it down to a really simple definition, which would be a change in populations over time. And remember, a population is a group of the same species. So many individuals of the same, or more than one individual of the same species. So if we're talking about zebras, a population would be a bunch of zebras, right? So just one species. And how that population changes over time is evolution. So we're talking really at the generational level here. So generation to generation. So a little bit more detailed scientific definition of evolution would be a change in gene frequencies in populations over generations. Don't worry too much about what specifically gene frequencies are, but just basically how prevalent genes are in a population. Can you cover your face? Thanks. So we're talking large timescales here and very slow. It's a very slow process. Oh, right. So I put just a little clarification here for the different pieces of this slightly more complicated definition. So the change is in heritable characteristics, which heritable just means it can be inherited, right? Something that's passed down through that information flow pathway. So eye color, hair color, height, all of that. Those are heritable characteristics. Populations, group of organisms, basically the same species, and then time measured in generations. Okay. So that's our definition of evolution moving forward. And specifically, we're going to focus in on a part of evolution called natural selection. Have most people heard of the term natural selection? Probably at this point in your lives. Okay, so there's a few different processes that can lead to evolution. That's for Bio 2 if you go on to that. It's interesting to learn about. But the most large scale and most influential way that evolution occurs is through natural selection. And I think everyone probably has a decent kind of rough understanding of what I mean by natural selection. But it's just when organisms become more well adapted to their environment. So an organism that is more well adapted to its environment is going to reproduce more, have more offspring, and pass on its genes at a higher frequency than maybe an organism that is poorly adapted and gets eaten early on before it can really reproduce a whole lot. So the better genes are basically passed on at a higher rate because they're better, because they're more well adapted to that environment. There we go. Yeah, so the number of individuals that have these advantageous or good traits, like the better traits, are going to increase in the next generation. And then they'll increase even more in the next generation. So it just kind of amplifies itself to where you don't have a bunch of poorly adapted organisms living in an environment. You have over a lot of time, more and more well-adapted organisms. Obviously, the environment can change, so this is kind of sort of constantly shifting. If the environment changes, maybe now a different set of genes creates a more better adapted organism. So this isn't constant, it's not static. The only constant is change. All right, so I want to give you a good, pretty simple to understand, but real world example of how this natural selection can happen. I think that's what I have next. Yes. These cute little mice. So this is the same species of mouse, of rock pocket mouse. So they're called pocket mice because I guess they're tiny enough to fit in your pocket, and they live on rocks. So they are primarily out west in the western US, among other places. But this is the same species. So we have a light colored version of the species and a dark colored version of the species. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to why there might be two different colors? Yes.
Because they live in two different areas, like the ground is different colors.
Yeah, exactly. So for you guys on Zoom, it's likely due to the fact that they live in different habitats, different colors of habitat, right? That's kind of a natural assumption that we have. We've seen this among you've probably seen it in other animals. The idea is to blend in, especially as a little tiny mouse, because you don't want to get eaten. So what has happened, going on to the next slide. So for the most part, throughout evolutionary history, these little mice lived in light colored rock areas. So this color morph did a lot better. There was always the gene for this darker color. So these guys popped up every once in a while, but obviously they didn't last very long because they were eaten by owls or hawks. They were eaten by owls or hawks pretty quickly, so they couldn't pass on their genes very effectively because they were picked off. They stick out like a sore thumb, right? They started to inhabit these lava flow areas in the western US. So now the little darker colored guy has a huge advantage because he blends in a lot better than the light colored morph. So now we see this kind of split between the two habitats. Far more individuals of the dark color morph are found in the lava flow, dark colored areas. And then more of the light colored morph are found in the light colored areas. So that's a really simple, direct example of how evolution can sort of change the trajectory of a population. And perhaps over time, eventually, if these two color morphs don't interact all that much, maybe they separate into two different species if they change enough from each other and can no longer interbreed. But that's the idea behind evolution, just becoming more well adapted to the habitat. That's a simple example, but I think a pretty straightforward and easy to understand one. Oh, whoops. Nope. Okay. All right, so those are the main themes. So what I want you guys to do now, I just have this simple table that I'm going to hand out, and you guys on Zoom, hopefully you've downloaded it by now. Fill out the first row. So all I'm asking is for you to state one of those major themes, give an example. You can use one that I gave, but it might be more helpful to come up with one of your own. And then just write out an explanation of what is meant by that theme. So kind of or you can illustrate it, I guess, but provide an explanation of that theme. So you're going to fill out, there's 3 rows on here. You guys, when you pair up, are going to fill out the first row. And then we'll come back together, talk about it a little bit. And then you'll fill out the last 2 rows on your own for homework and then upload it to Canvas. So there's an assignment set up for you so you can upload it, a picture for you guys if you're filling it out by hand, or you can upload the document for you guys on Zoom. All right, so let me split you guys into breakout groups. Okay. And then hand these out. So there's no pressure. I'm just trying to get you guys to think about it, kind of on your own, and really try to come up with an example of your own. Yeah, just pass this straight back. So pair up with someone or get in a group of 3, that's fine. Try to keep a little bit of distance between you. But work together, it'll make it a lot quicker and easier, and you'll probably have better results. Okay, guys, you 2 are going to pair up. So if you want to move up, and then if you guys in the back can pair up, just kind of move towards each other. You 3 want to pair up somehow, just kind of talk amongst yourselves, and then you 2 can pair up. Yeah, just, yeah, sorry. And yeah, you 2 in the back. So just pick a theme, pick an example, and kind of explain it very briefly. Not a whole lot of detail. All right, yeah, you can move back to where you were. Or you can stay where you are, doesn't matter. Okay, so hopefully that was kind of helpful to at least make you think about it beyond me just giving you all of the information. So does anyone, let's start with Zoom people. So does any of the groups, do you guys want to just tell me kind of the theme you chose in the example? You don't have to tell me the explanation. Can I get a volunteer?
I can share.
Okay.
So me and my group chose the theme of like energy and matter, and our example was like how plants get energy from the sun and turn that into chemical energy.
Yeah, perfect. That's exactly it. I think a lot of people chose energy and matter. It must be one that people are familiar with. Good job. Thank you. All right, someone from the in-class group or in-class section who wants to give me their example. Go ahead. Great. Yeah. Okay, so for you guys on Zoom, a group here chose the interactions theme, and their example was a frog eating a fly. So yeah, predation is a really, really common and often thought of interaction. So that's perfect. Okay, so fill out those last 2. The last row you'll see is specifically about evolution. So you'll want to think about something specific for that. I kind of forced you to talk about the core theme. And then just upload that by the beginning of class, so by noon on Wednesday. And I'm not looking for extreme detail. These handouts are sort of a, did you put in effort and are you on the right track or not kind of thing. So it's a, I don't know if I described this, but kind of a 2-1-0. So you get 2 points if you have a good amount of detail and are on the right track, a 1 if it's not quite correct, or you didn't put in much effort, and a 0 if it's just not turned in. Okay, so the last 2 you'll work in, on your own, or you can work with someone else if you want to, that's fine. It's up to you, it doesn't have to be done individually. Okay. So those are the themes. At the end of this PowerPoint, I actually have, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through them, but this will be a good kind of self-quiz for you if you want to do it. I put a few slides here with some examples and then asked you to tell me the themes. So the answers to each of these are, if you download the PowerPoint file, in the little notes section underneath, I have them numbered with the correct answer. So that would be probably a good idea to do before the quiz on Friday. Just kind of quiz yourself, see if you know what these pictures and examples are representing from the major themes. Okay, any questions before we move on? We're gonna dip our toe into chemistry today. Okay. All right. Okay, so for this next chapter, we're going to be talking about some basics of chemistry, since I've told you probably 8 times now that everything can be broken down into atoms, right? And then those atoms build together to form whatever organism we're talking about. So we're going to start with some of the basics of chemistry and chemical bonding, because those interactions are really important to form what we see as biology. Water is critically important as well. So we're going to talk a good bit about water, some properties of water, what a water molecule looks like, and the important properties of water. Okay, so let's get started. If you're ever confused about anything in this chemistry, if you haven't really had chemistry before, or maybe you just didn't really understand it the first time around, feel free to stop and ask me. I don't want to go over anyone's head. I want everyone kind of on the same page. So if you don't know a term that I refer to, please stop and ask. Or if you don't want to stop me in class, come see me during office hours. It's hard to know where everyone kind of starts with chemistry because people are sort of on different levels. So what we're going to talk about in this chapter is going to be first atoms and molecules, just kind of the basics. How atoms form molecules, specifically with chemical bonds. And then, like I said, we'll talk about water. It's really important. So we're going to talk about it specifically as a molecule. And then some on acids and bases. So just a little bit about acidic versus basic compounds. So we have about 10 minutes left. Probably won't get to the chemical bonds. We'll just do some basics of the atoms and molecules today. All right, so back to this image. I basically just want to remind you that all of these kind of higher levels of the biological organization all come back to these atoms and molecules the atoms interacting with each other to form molecules. So we're starting at the very base here. We can actually break down humans as well as the Earth, but I'm going to ignore that side. We can break us down into individual elements. So what elements make us up primarily? 99% of us is made up of just a very few elements. So 99% of a living organism's weight, I should say. So this goes beyond just humans. Carbon is huge. We're going to talk a lot about carbon. Hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and calcium. So you want to know these elements and know that the vast majority of living organisms are composed primarily of those very few elements. If you've ever seen a periodic table, there's a lot of elements, right? Oh, there's one. That periodic table, there's far more elements on it than we have listed here. They're all important in one way or another, maybe not in living organisms, but these, 7? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 6 elements are critical for life to exist. So this is really just remember those elements and know that they make up the majority of an organism. You don't have to memorize all of that. That's mostly just to kind of show you the breakdown. Okay, so into atoms. We're going to talk about chemistry at sort of a I guess, a superficial or sort of simpler level, because really all I want you to understand from the chemical aspect is how it forms, how the interactions occur to make more complex structures. So that's what I'm going to focus on with our chemistry stuff. So to start, we're going to go with an atom. So an atom is just one piece of an element, basically, I guess is the way to think of it. So the periodic chart of the elements, all of those letters represent an element or sets of letters. And an atom is just one individual piece of it. So there can be multiple atoms that are going to interact that will form a molecule. We're going to start with just one. And we have the nucleus, and I'm sorry if this is really extremely elementary for you, but again, I want to make sure everyone's on the same page. You have the nucleus in the middle of the atom. The nucleus has protons and neutrons. Protons are positively charged. Neutrons are neutral, or they don't have a charge. So those are represented here, right in the middle, in the nucleus. For the most part, we do not care about the protons and neutrons in an atom for our purposes. We care about the electrons. The electrons are the interesting part of the atom because they are what allow for chemical bonding. So how many electrons there are will determine if this atom will bond with another atom or not. The electrons are found in what we call electron shells or energy levels around the nucleus. And this is a pretty simplified version of what an atom actually looks like to break it down in a sort of understandable way. These electrons are really kind of flying all around in different crazy orbits in this cloud around the nucleus. But for our understanding, it really helps to think about them in these nice, neat little energy levels, right? Okay, so electrons are the important ones, the important subatomic particles. How many are in different energy levels will determine if that atom will interact with another atom. So a couple of rules here. The first energy level around an atom, so there can be many, many energy levels. We're really only going to go out to like 3, mostly just, 1 to 3 energy levels is what we'll be looking at with the elements that we're concerned with. The first energy level can only hold 2 electrons. And a chemistry class or maybe in a physics class, you'll go into the theory behind that. We're not going to do that here. The first electron shell holds 2 electrons. For our purposes, all of them beyond that hold 8. So you jump from being able to hold 2 electrons to being able to hold 8 electrons. That doesn't mean they have 8 electrons, but they can fit 8 electrons in the second and the third energy shells, essentially. And there's a really important rule called the octet rule, where atoms want a full outer energy shell. So if they have 2 energy shells, they want to have 8 electrons. It just makes them happy and stable and balanced. So they want to fill up their outermost. Hydrogen is the only atom or element we'll talk about that only has 1 energy shell. So it just needs 2. So it has 1, it needs 1 more electron. But for the most part, it's called the octet rule because pretty much all of the other elements want 8 because they have more than just 1 energy shell. All right, so 8 is the goal in that outermost energy shell with the exception of hydrogen, which wants 2. And because we focus so much on the outer shell, the inner shells don't really matter. So the outer shell has a special name. It's called the valence shell. And the electrons in that outermost shell are called valence electrons. I don't know where that word comes from. I don't know the origin behind it, but valence means just the outermost shell. So the number of electrons in that valence shell is going to determine if and how an atom will bond to another atom. So because these atoms all want the happy 8 electrons, if they don't have 8 electrons, they want to bond with something else that has some electrons that they can share or just take. So if we look at these 4 elements, these are 4 elements you want to be really familiar with. The symbol, so a C for carbon, an N for nitrogen, O for oxygen, and H for hydrogen. Those are going to come up over and over again, particularly C, H, and O. So I wanted to focus on these and let you know how many valence electrons they have. Hydrogen is such a simple atom. It only has 1 electron total. So it only has 1 energy level with that 1 electron in it. So it just needs 1 more to complete that energy shell. So it's pretty reactive. It can react with a lot of different things because it only needs 1 electron. It's not like it needs 7 electrons to fill it. Oxygen has 6 valence electrons. So how many more does it need in that outer shell? 2, yeah. So it only needs 2, great. So they'll be paired with those 2. Nitrogen has 5 valence electrons, so it needs 3 more to fill that outer shell. Carbon has 4, so it needs 4 more. But it's all nice and balanced because they're all spread out, right? And you can see on each of these, the lower energy level is already filled. So in order to have a second energy level, that first energy level has to be filled with 2 electrons, which it is for everything except for hydrogen. Okay. So I think we'll actually stop there, yeah. We'll get into how to understand the periodic table a little bit, just for the purposes of valence electron numbers on Wednesday, and then get into some chemical bonding. Any questions before we go?